Hello, Gary.
Hello, Guy. So this is our day off. We're recording this the day before the night after... so the night after Brighton, the day before we play Ipswich, and 2 days before the Albert Hall, which happened, if you're listening on a Sunday here, last night.
And for those of you watching in black and white, the
He's
Red
about
Bull...
to pop. Yeah. So we've got a producers episode on today. We've got some highlight from 4 of our major producers that we had on over the last couple of years. We've got Steve Lillywhite, Bob Ezrin, Hugh Padgham, and Trevor Horn. They were good guests, weren't they?
They were great guests, all very different in their own way. In fact, Gary, I'll be interested because you're someone... Because you get there's different types of producers. You get someone like Trevor Horn, where it's what I'm interested in is hearing a Trevor Horn record. And I'm sorry, obviously the artist is going to be great because his choice of artists that he works with is going to be great. But it's essentially, he's so overarching, whereas someone like Hugh Padgham, he's very much going to give you a great artist. He knows how to bring that. And same with Steve Lillywhite. Steve has a fantastically indefinable thing. I know from when I've worked with him, where you come out, you just played a song and you came out and it's amazing. And you're like, what happened? He did something. And so I wonder for someone like you, Gary, I can't imagine that you've ever gone in the studio without a very strong vision of what you want to do.
Yeah, I think that's why it was tricky to work with Trevor to a large extent with Spandau. Certainly in the early days when he first took on the idea of producing the True album for us, and it didn't really work out. Trevor's a musician. I mean, there are 2 kinds of producers, aren't there? Some comes from music, being musicians, and others are engineers primarily. Trevor knows the kind of... In a way, he was always using the artists as sort of paint for the picture that he wanted to make, really. And then they would go out and sell that record by promoting it on whatever it might be. Where Steve, being an engineer, but also was more into the psychology of the band. How do I make this band happy? Or how do I make this band angry enough to make the best record I've ever made? Those kind of things. So I think in the end, we chose Gary Langan in the end to do quite a few of our albums because he was Trevor Horn's engineer. So he got Trevor's sounds, but we could then have our own creative ideas in the studio.
Yeah, because I mean, actually, I want to go into this. The first time you went into it, because was Burgess the first producer you worked with?
Yeah, so he was a musician.
Yeah, but so what was it? That wasn't the first time you'd been in the studio. I mean, what was it like the first time you went in with a producer? And then what did you have in your mind? Was it incredibly exciting, or were you thinking, oh no, I'm going to have to hand over the reins to someone else?
Yeah, I think, James Burgess was in a band called Landscape, so he was sort of jazz steeped, but really into electronica, and they made that record Einstein a Go-Go. He was hanging out in the Blitz Club. He'd seen us play a few times. He knew exactly who we were. And I think what he said to me is, I just want to capture you. I just want to make you sound as you are. So there was a kind of garage quality about what that production, that early production. He didn't want to fill it up with too many synthesizers, but he did also introduce us to electronica through drums. So he introduced us to the Simmons kit. So we were one of the first bands to use that on the track chart number 1. But I think, yes, we knew what we wanted. We wanted to really capture the spirit of the band. I don't think we were into too many overdubs. It was how we sounded live. And we went to Trident Studios, of course, which, was thrilling for us because it was where Electric Warrior and Ziggy Stardust and Hunky Dory, where they were all made in that building. But I think as we went along, I think when we went into our second album, I think Richard was probably the wrong man for the job then, because he wasn't allowing us to sort of be more adventurous in the studio. So we shifted to more musical people, Swain and Jolly, who, they were different people entirely. They got harmony. They offered vocal harmony up to the band for the first time.
But I guess there's a thing of essentially your vision had to kind of coincide with the producers. I'm getting the feeling there wasn't a whole lot of argument amongst the band.
No, it has to I think I was probably dominant in the studio. within the band. That's the way. I mean, it's never ever going to work if all 4 or 5 members of the group sit in the studio control room at the same time, all with their ideas just banging against the producer's head. You know, that's a nightmare. So bands kind of silently allocate their leaders, don't they? That's normally what happens. There's not a vote, but and where bands I think fall into issues probably is when there are 2 leaders and they're both in dispute in the room, and that you've got to have great sympathy for the producer. I mean, have you experienced that kind of stuff?
No, but I've certainly stepped into a situation where that was an issue before. It's not even a matter of a leader; it's a matter of when you got alphas butting heads. You know, that's.
But what about when you're?
But isn't that a lot of a producer's job? Is to be able to negotiate that.
Yeah, well, it is, and I think they need to really understand the personalities before they walk into the room. And I do think psychology is everything. And I think in a way, as much as we love Trevor and I love Trevor, I think Trevor really wasn't interested in that side of stuff. But what he was offering you was the most incredible record you'll ever make. Probably,
yeah, although I must say, because I've worked with Trevor a lot over the years, and I love it. It's one of my favourite things. So basically, it's just being in a room with him as a mate, and it's just because everything somehow sounds like that. It's just like, what the fuck is it? Why is it sounding like that? But what's always amazes me is how much more of a band. Like I said, I always assumed, from listening to his records, that it was all about white coats and recorded in a clean room in some incredible sort of environment you make microchips in. But it's not. He's very much a band guy. He's a player guy, and it's just really weird that a lot of it is we perceive his records to not be that, but they are. You go back and listen to Slave of the Rhythm, and 80% of that is just guys in a room.
Yeah, but I think, and I remember from when we spoke to Trevor, that I think he said something like, what really upsets him is when he's a better musician than any of the guys in the band. Which
Steve took issue with, didn't he? Which I thought was a very interesting point, because right there you see the difference in producers, where Steve says it's not a matter of you being better than them, it's a matter of those are the guys you've got, and those are the guys whose record you're making. And I take my hat off to that as well.
And I think it's important that they can go out and, well, here's the dilemma, right? Here's the thing. And in a way, the Beatles did this for us, because the Beatles said, we're not playing live anymore. We're going to go into a studio and make the studio a 5th instrument in the band. And we're going to make records that it doesn't matter if you can ever play live, because we're not going to do it. And I think Trevor was not considering necessarily whether or not the band in the room could ever reproduce that record live. Now, where someone like Hugh Padgham, working for the Police, 100% was making a record that could be easily performed live, because it was basically only 3 people playing on the record with very, very few overdubs, if any at all.
Yeah, that's true. But it's quite interesting, though. But this is where you get the dark arts. Like Hugh's a great example of this. Like, yes, those Police records are incredibly simple. They're just bass, drums, and a guitar. But that bass is like 14 tracks of electric double bass overdubbed, one on top of the other. So it sounds amazing.
Wow, I never knew that. That is strange, because there must be diminishing returns after a while where it just goes into fog.
You'd think, yeah. Exactly.
But interestingly, Hugh doesn't always stick to that brief, because later on, he's making In the Air Tonight with a drum sound that's utterly impossible to reproduce live unless it's a sample.
Yeah, I get. Yeah.
So I think with these are all the different approaches.
No, if you took a lexicon on the road, I don't want to get bogged down. This is not going to be of interest to our listeners, but
no. But
we have by the way, dear listeners, we have a thing. We're on tour. We'll get to that in a second, but we do have a thing. If anyone veers into boring gear territory conversation, we just say inflate the travel pillow, because we just have a thing about those pillows that people around their necks wear around their necks when they're flying.
Yeah. So if it's really boring, you just want to fall asleep into one of those. Yes, that was nearly inflate the travel pillow.
That was nearly it, yeah.
But the one producer we haven't mentioned out of these 4 that we're going to show some highlight clips from. We're doing highlight clips because it's really tricky for us to interview while we're on tour, to make arrangements between artists and us to fit in exactly at the right time when we land in a hotel or wherever it might be. We do have some penciled in, but it has been a little tricky.
Yeah, it is not for want of trying. We'd like to make that very clear.
It is, but hopefully you're still listening to the show and engaged in what Guy and I have to ramble on about, and also catching up on some really nice clips that Ben Jones has put together for us. The one producer we haven't mentioned out of these four that are coming up is Bob Ezrin, and Bob is someone you personally have.
Yeah, no, I know Bob very well. But and the thing,
what's his style? What's his thing?
Well, so I haven't done that much studio work with him. What's interesting was, my first time I encountered him was he was brought in to kind of as director, producer, but in a director. Because it's funny, isn't it? Because the term record producer, it's funny. If it's basically, if it was a film, he'd be the director, really. But in France, for instance, the record producer is the producer because he has to find the money. So. Yeah, so which is interesting, isn't it? But it was, and so Bob was brought in to kind of direct the show because that was the one element that was lacking since someone had left the band, and he was amazing at that. But see, to me, I used to think of Bob Ezrin the way I think of Trevor. I mean, his records were the poshest sounding records.
He's a musical guy, though, isn't he?
Incredible. And the thing that I love about him, and I think you do, and I think that it was, as well as having that fantastic fidelity, those amazing sounding arranged records, but those Alice Cooper records were incredible. And that first Gabriel album is still just unsurpassed,
Absolutely.
But he's got that theatrical thing. He's looking at it as theatre, and
that's interesting, isn't it? Because we were talking about producers wanting realising that this band is going to have to promote the record live. Could they do it? Well, obviously Bob's records are very posh, and he does use the studio a lot. But he's thinking the bigger picture. He was thinking of especially certainly with Alice and with the Floyd, with The Wall. He was working with the artist how we could develop this into a bigger show.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at a song like The Trial, from which he's actually got a writing credit on, which is just fantastic, sort of Cod, Gilbert and Sullivan, whatever.
Yeah. What about you as a session player back in certainly back in the 80s and 90s? But what did you want from a producer when you walked in?
It's actually the other way around, isn't it? It's what did a producer want from me? Because that's the thing in that most of my work is that, like, I have admittedly very impressive list of artists that I've worked with, but that's not because I was hired by those artists. Most of those are producers I had producer relationships. Like, I had a relationship with Pat Leonard, with Trevor, with Steve Lillywhite, and so it was the producer for a lot of the time. I didn't know who the artist was until I got there. And
would the producer be just saying, like, well, I want you here, you're in the room because I want you to be you, Guy?
Yeah.
Or were they also saying, look, this is the kind of music that we're talking about here. This is what the band want. This is probably because you were probably dealing mostly with, not with bands, were you? Because bands would have their own bass player. Yeah. You were dealing with solo artists mostly, weren't you?
And although there's quite a few times where it's actually me on a record is a band. But
could this be time for the Michael Jackson story?
Oh God, no. But that's the interesting one, because I was picked by Michael Jackson because he'd heard Like a Prayer, and he wanted that. He wanted me to play that, and I was thinking this is going to be brilliant because for anyone who knows, Like a Prayer, which is probably the highlight of my career. It's the middle section and the end section where there's just this insane sort of bass workout with an octave pedal, full balls out, showing off kind of nonsense. And so I was, and they said they want that for Michael Jackson. I was like, oh my God, this is going to be
so amazing. Hang on, you said the beginning section and the end section?
No, the middle section and the end section.
And the end section. Yeah. Oh, I see.
Yeah,
okay.
When the choir's in and everything, it's the middle end. And but when I turned up for the Michael Jackson song was Earth Song, which of course is this huge ballad, and it was like, what the hell am I supposed to do with that? And
come on, where was Michael?
That's the funny thing. I kept going to the studio, And they go, sorry, Michael's just left, so come back tomorrow. And, Michael liked this, he didn't like that. Didn't know, what if we could try this? All right. So they said, come back tomorrow, and Michael will be here. And I go back tomorrow, and Michael had just left. And this happened about 3 or 4 times. So I was getting really fed up. And I said, look, Michael could just be here, tell me what he wants, I'll do it. We can all go home. Obviously, I didn't say that at all. But... And then, so I get a call from Bill Bottrell, who was producing. That was the link. He said, Guy, come in. Michael's here. He's not leaving. So I rushed down the studio. This was in LA. I should point out, this was this nuts period of my life. I had to rush to the studio from my session with Robbie Robertson, whose album I was doing
from
at
the band.
time.
Yeah,
yeah, which is amazing. And I get there, and Michael's just left, but there was a very, very different vibe in the studio, and there was this sort of there was this new engineer, and you can't see me, but I'm doing inverted commas. I say engineer because it was this giant Samoan bloke, someone who'd be sort of more suited to being, I don't know, a bodyguard perhaps. And he was standing down one end of the mixing desk, and I wasn't allowed to get down there. I was trying to, you could smoke in studios back there. I was trying to get an ashtray or something. This guy literally wouldn't let me go down there. I was like, all right. So I started playing, and we get to the end of the song, and this engineer suddenly leans over behind the desk, and he's sort of nodding his head, and he comes back up and he goes, yeah, I think Michael would find that appropriate. I'm like, what? So this bloke who has the most tenuous grasp of the English language somehow has an absolutely intrinsic understanding of what Michael Jackson would require from a bass performance. And then I suddenly realised, hang on, someone is hiding behind the mixing desk telling this guy what to tell me. Oh my God, Michael Jackson is hiding behind the mixing desk. And I couldn't say it, so I'm looking at Bill, the producer, and his eyes are just going, don't look at me, don't look at me, don't look at me. And so everyone, obviously, we all know he's there. And we just have to go along with this thing. Of literally me waiting for Michael to tell his bodyguard what he wants, what he likes, and what he doesn't.
What happened at the end of the session?
I can't really remember.
He never poked his head out, though?
No, never. No, but he was hiding a lot at the time. He was famously hiding. He had this was when he'd had his nose broken something like 12 times at that point, and apparently there was no surgeon in LA would touch him, and he was having to go down to Costa Rica to get stuff done. And he'd had some cheekbone implants. So apparently had this flap of skin hanging off under his eye, and it looked dreadful.
Looked like he'd just come out of a Millwall pub.
Yeah, exactly. But at the time he was doing, he had a meeting with Nile Rodgers about him producing his album, literally in the same week. Nile went out to his place in Encino, and knocked on the door of the office. They said he's in there. Knocked on the door and heard this weird scuffling, and then nothing. And then he thought, well, I guess I better go in. So he opened the door and he walked in, and it's this vast office. And he just goes and sits down at the desk, and it becomes it's very apparent that someone is just hiding under the desk in front of him.
Did he have a conversation?
You can't say anything. He just sat there, and it was just so awkward. He had to leave, I think, and then he would, and then he just saw sort of Michael frolicking with a deer outside or something.
Mr. Jackson can't be here. He sent his wardrobe. Could you talk to the wardrobe?
Yeah, exactly. So, that was
fantastic. So should we get Steve Lillywhite's clip rolled up?
Yeah, come on. Okay, let's talk about the band then.
Which one?
The Irish Boys.
Oh, yes.
You obviously did their first 3 albums and other stuff with them later on, but so I'm taking it. You mentioned you saying that you wanted to be your own A&R man. Did you sort of discover them, Steve? Or?
Yeah. I remember getting sent a cassette of their, it was demos, but it was also their independent release in Ireland. Produced by Chaz DeWally, I think, weirdly, who was an A&R man at CBS. I think I'm right in saying that.
He could be part of he could now join your songwriting duo.
Wally Pratt Lillywhite.
Yeah.
Lillywhite, Pratt and Wally. DeWally, yeah. And I remember thinking it was a little, and I liked it, but, in those days, and still now, if I was to produce again, I would like to see them live. Because for me, when an artist plays live, they're not thinking about what they're doing. And part of my job in a studio is to enable them to be creative and not having to think really what they're doing. You know, I mean, it's a weird thing, but if they're analyzing too much, stays remember, recording studios was Star Trek. People didn't have anything at home. So it was like, it's a studio. Oh my God. And I'd been king of the studio I'd been in studio since I was 17. So even when
you'd been locked in a room at the back.
Well, yeah, but exactly. But still, I was I got it by osmosis. Yeah. And so when I was 24 on the first U2 album, Bono was 19, Adam was 19, and Larry was 17. So even though we were close in age, there's a big gap. 5 years at that age.
Oh, it's huge.
It's huge in those days. So I was, and I'm very proud actually that I was the first person ever to make a successful rock album in Ireland, because Thin Lizzy, Rory Gallagher, Boomtown Rats, they all came over to London.
Where did you do it? Windmill? Was it Windmill?
At Windmill Lane, yeah. And of course, I walked into Windmill Lane and it was a studio made for recording folk music. Well, you worked there, right? Because you lived there for a while. Walking through the reception of Windmill Lane, it was like this nice stone place. And that was where the girls sat, because there weren't mobile phones. So if you needed to speak to someone, you call the main number and the receptionist would put it through to the different studios, and there was also the video editing at Windmill Lane upstairs, right? You remember that? So I wanted to record the drums in the hallway. Just said, but that's where the girl sits. I go, well, what time does she go home? She goes home at 6 o'clock. I said, okay, we'll record the drums after 6 o'clock. At which point Larry had a problem because his dad said he had to be home because he was only 17 and his dad was worried about him. So on the Boy album, it was very much a, but even then, Bono hadn't finished all his lyrics. I think I work best with those sort of people who aren't craftsmen as songwriters. And I do believe in that, in making something in the studio, that setting up a scene that can make a unique situation.
Did you sense that The Edge had a sound that could make this band unique?
Well, yes, he was definitely the metronome of the band. He would play through the echo. So that was the sort of tempo of how they worked.
It's funny because those echoes, like the Memory Man and stuff that he used to use. Because what's interesting is that, yes, everything's set to that time, but you couldn't precisely set those times, could you?
No. So it was, I didn't use a click with them until the third album. Using a click, I don't know about you. Did you ever make your records without a click track, Gary?
No, we use clicks.
Everyone, yeah.
So it was clicking away in his headphones while he was playing,
Yeah. No, on the first two U2 albums, I didn't really start doing clicks until 1983. And it was a fantastic thing, but it was sometimes, if the musicians couldn't play well to the click, it just felt like it was slowing down. When there was a drum fill, it felt like it was so...
Wow. Yeah. So we all know from computer music that we make, now it's so rigid, isn't it? There's no movement.
Double time is not double time, and half time is not half time.
Well, you look at a drummer like...
when you've got a click, it is,
Yeah, I mean, Stuart Copeland, his whole tempo and rhythm is so at the front of the beat. It's fantastic, and it's like pushing at the front. But then you've got, like, say, Jerry Marotta or his brother Rick Marotta, those like American, or the band, those sort of people who right on the back end of the beat.
Nick Mason,
absolutely. And it's wonderful the nuance between all the different styles, and that's what is slightly missing in musicians now, because drummers are fantastic now playing to clicks, because they can give and they take, and they it's almost like they don't have to be completely in with the click for it to work. They just like to hear it for something.
So we were talking about Bob Ezrin, weren't we? So now we're going to Alice Cooper. Now he tried everything, didn't he, to sort of get broken early on?
Yeah, but first of all, I think he went to the West Coast, didn't he? I mean, where were they from? Detroit?
They're from Detroit.
And then he went to the West Coast to try and hang out with the Mamas and the Papas and try.
Yeah, and it was all wrong.
You know, ride on that wave, completely wrong. It's a bloke who sort of, you know, kills animals virtually on stage, or so gets executed. But I think, you know, we spoke earlier about Bob trying, you know, really engaging with Alice's theatricality and trying to break him. That way.
But here's the thing: we still say, because what's interesting is that back then, you got to remember they were thinking of Alice Cooper was this band.
It was,
you know, and it's a really funny thing. How it's one of those things where because I think, you know, where it was so personified as Alice that eventually he gave up and just went, all right, I'm Alice. But because the point was, he wasn't, was he? He was Vince Furnier.
Yeah. But I love those records, by the way. Oh, you know,
they're incredible. And Welcome to My Nightmare. Just the production is woof.
Let's get him on, Bob Ezrin.
Bob, I'm going to steer your brain back into I'm 18, right? Okay. Because I'm 18 broke Alice. And it's still, you know, it's one of his great pieces. He still does it. How do you get to love that, would you? It's like singing.
Let's hope I die before I get old, isn't it?
My Generation.
Yeah.
You know, the great thing about the Alice Cooper songs is that they're all little pieces of theater too. So it's almost as though he's doing he's doing a show, like many, you know, and Gary, you would know this better than any of us, you know, like you go and you do a show and you play it every night for some period of time on stage. And every night you find a little something different. You find, you know, there's something in it that you notice or something in it that you do slightly differently that keeps it alive for you and keeps it interesting. In his case, you know, every night it's a different audience. And every night the audience reacts in a slightly different way. And that fuels him. Like he loves, you know, Alice is a true showman, obviously, and loves the applause and loves the interchange with the audience. And so he's been playing a lot of these songs for 50 years, longer. I mean, I'm 18. They already had that when I went to see them at Max's Kansas City on September 8th in 1970. They had already been playing it for a year. I thought it was I'm Edgy when I saw the show, because I'm 18 and I don't know what I want. I'm 18 and I'm going, I'm edgy. Ooh, that's hip. So I told them I thought that would be a big song. I love that I'm Edgy song, and they look at each other like, what? Oh, I'm 18. Yes, even better.
And of course, it went on to be that was the song that John Lydon sang in Along to the Jukebox in Malcolm Vivian's shop that got him the gig with the Sex Pistols. So
that's right.
Bookends the 70s.
Yeah, it does, and it's a good song.
But where did you? Yeah, I mean, but that album and Killer, you know, I mean, they are more just they're rock, straight up glam rock and roll. But then something begins to happen with him, with School's Out, I guess, and of course, School's Out. What a record! I mean, I remember that, you know, and that album cover. Christ, Guy, did you have that album cover with the panties? But I remember,
it was not. But I was still at primary school. But I remember it was
I hid those panties
that made me first aware of the idea of record production. You know, that because they sounded magnificent. Which going on to Welcome to My Nightmare was the one that's when you suddenly think, oh my God, what is going on here? Just in terms of sound.
But Guy, can I say, I hid those.
You're going to show them to us now, aren't you?
Mum and Dad, you're going to show them to us now, aren't you? I don't have them with me. I don't.
He's wearing them.
They stopped putting them on the cover because they were a fire hazard. They were a fire hazard. They were so hot. That was true.
It is. They were a fire hazard, and technically.
Basically, for people who don't know, it was a school
simpler
desk.
times. You could give away panties. They could be a fire hazard. I mean, there was, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and when you lifted up the desk, inside was the record with panties paper panties wrapped around.
Yeah.
Even the word makes me feel odd.
It's okay, but I'll tell you what it does. The word panties and paper panties in particular is it points out that you need a pop filter. Just saying.
I do. Thank you, producer.
Have you done that before? Have you done that before, Bob? Is that a thing? Because that was way too smooth.
Just came up.
developing Alice's theatrical sound with those boys, was it, there was a moment when you said, you know what, we don't need to just make all this music with you, with the band. We can start orchestrating this. We can add stuff.
Well,
Use other musicians.
Let's back up a little bit, because there was theatricality there was Black Juju on Love It to Death, which was a remarkable piece it was a little bit like Walk on Gilded Splinters, Dr. John. It was creepy and weird, and he stopped and he yelled and he did all kinds of strange things, and so that was a sort of foray into it. And then and of course Dead Babies later had a great deal of theater, but on Killer, we had the whole long, Halo of Flies long theatrical piece there, so we were starting to experiment. Then we get to Schools Out. The interesting thing about Schools Out was we had changed studios. Up until Schools Out, I was Jack Jr. I was working in Jack's favorite studio with Jack's favorite engineer, in Jack's way, with Jack's kind of sounds, sort of. I was, only Jack was Jack, but I had learned drum sounds from Jack Richardson. I was using the mics he preferred and all that sort of stuff. Then I get to New York at the record plant, which is this incredible crucible of creativity, just a bunch of wacko young men playing with toys. Suddenly all this new technology, and there were a few of them that were inventing the technology at the time. So we get there and suddenly, whoa, the sounds are different. You can do all kinds of things that I couldn't do at RCA Mid-America Studios in Chicago at number 1 North Wacker. But also, there were people on the staff at the record plant who played instruments. So I could like me, right? So suddenly I could add a piano, me, and I could add a dulcimer, and that would be Paul Prestipino, and he would come in and play. He was one of the maintenance guys, but he played, a great sort of mandolin, dulcimer, whatever it was that we had him do. Also in New York, you could rent anything. So I could rent a calliope, which I used on the Kiss album for Flamin' Youth, they died. But I was like, wait, people will talk about this forever.
So Kiss. This is so Kiss. So Hugh Padgham.
Hugh, who I see quite a lot, seeing as he actually only lives 3 doors down from us in London.
Did he come to our show the other night?
He did. He came to Bristol. No, you couldn't stay, so we couldn't get the Rockonteurs picture.
But did you chat with him?
I did chat, yeah. He loved it. It was really what's so nice is and what's so great. There's the Pink Floyd thing that everyone has in their heads until they come and see us. And Hugh was an absolute brilliant example of that. It's like, oh my God, to hear those songs again. And just talking about, and everyone's got the kind of sort of I've set the controls in my bedroom in the dark and all, and all that, and it was really, really nice, because it's I think what is great about this band, Gary, is people, we don't realise just how fixed imperial period Pink Floyd is in people's heads.
That's right, and they've almost forgotten about those early days. But because we never remind people at the beginning who are listening to this for the first time. Guy and I play with Nick Mason in Nick Mason's Saucerful of Secrets, and we are currently out on the road doing the first 5 Floyd albums. Well, but interestingly, you talk to most of the people of our age, and certainly a little bit older, and those early Floyd things were very, very influential. I would have thought for a producer, what the Floyd were doing was, the psychedelic stuff and the more abstract type of music and things like Set the Controls, suddenly allowing songs to be a lot longer and a lot more visual in a way, must have been inspiring for many producers. Steve Lillywhite said the same.
Because even, if you just to how kind of out there like Saucerful of Secrets is, and because they didn't really, other than stuff like Stockhausen, they didn't really have anything to refer back to in terms of people making records like that, did they? And their psychedelic freak out thing was based on a jazz model. Yeah, wasn't it? The thing of you play the riff and then you all go off and express yourself and then you come back to the riff.
I don't like you expressing yourself too much.
No, I know. You've made that very clear.
Hugh Padgham is someone, we talk about people coming up towards producing via being engineers. But I remember when he was, he was an engineer, but I think he embarrassingly either got called assistant engineer or even maybe tape op on our first album, because Richard was considered himself the engineer, Richard James Burgess, on the first Spandau Ballet albums. But on that first, we went to the Townhouse a few times, and it was Hugh. Hugh was the in-house guy.
Yeah, he was in-house, and which is a funny thing, which I think a lot of people might not know, but it was until the end of the 70s, till the 80s, when you made an album, you booked a studio, and it came with an engineer. You had the house engineer. And then it became, which is why Alan Parsons, engineered Dark Side of the Moon. Not because they asked for him, because he was the guy on Abbey, that was his shift at Abbey Road. And Hugh just happened to be, he did such fantastically interesting stuff, because the Townhouse, which is the studio where he worked, which is where I ended up having my own studio, which is one of the absolute, certainly for the 80s, definitive studios.
Yeah. It was on Uxbridge Road.
Goldhawk Road.
No. Goldhawk Road, which is parallel to Uxbridge Road. Sorry,
it used to be a film studio, and now, of course, is luxury flats, obviously. So he did things like he was the engineer on the Derek and Clive album, all sorts of stuff like, because he just happened to be the guy, and he happened to be the guy when the drummer from Genesis decided to try and do a solo record, and I think he ended up with the production credit for that, and the rest is geography.
It is. So here's Hugh Padgham talking about producing Sting. Ghost in the Machine was the first one.
Yeah.
I remember it coming out, and it had so much of your flavour on it. It wasn't just the 3-piece anymore. There was keyboards on there, there were sequencers, there was depth to the production. Was that something that you were inputting?
Well, yes, to an extent. I got the gig basically through XTC, and they used to tour quite a lot in those days together. And one day Sting and Andy Partridge were on a bus together, and Sting said, do you know what? We're looking for a new producer because we just want to change. And also the whole thing with the Police in those days, Miles Copeland was the manager, and everything was done as cheaply as possible. And they were amazing, those first 3 albums. But I think they just wanted a change. And also, it was around that time in the late 70s, early 80s, that synthesizers, and particularly polyphonic synthesizers, were just coming out. So there was a load of new gear, drum machines, sequencers, synthesizers. And when you're a big band, you always just get given stuff, don't you?
Yeah, when you can afford it, you get given it for free. What a joke.
I know. Phil Collins always used to say that. He said, I could never afford a drum kit when I was young. Now I've made some money, I'm just being given drum kits all the time. And he never used to accept them for that reason as well. It's rather ironical, isn't it? So I had met Sting on a session at the Townhouse before as well. So I just got the phone call and said, will you turn up in Montserrat and work with the Police? I'd never met Andy before. I'd met Stuart because he lived just down the road in Shepherd's Bush. But basically, I arrived in Montserrat with just a whole bunch of Sting's sort of rough demos, the band, and all this new gear. It was all Oberheim, mostly Oberheim.
Oh, right.
That we had. Do you remember?
And this is George Martin's Air Studio in Montserrat.
George Martin's Air Studios.
Did you watch Under the Volcano, that documentary? Did either of you watch
absolutely.
that? It's brilliant.
Yeah, I was in it for a few seconds.
Okay, there's a little bass player rumour that I'd like to get sorted out, which is that apparently Sting had this thing, certainly on Every Breath You Take.
But that's which wasn't on this album, though, Every Breath.
No, it wasn't on this album, but I think it might have been on many songs anyway, which was the reason for his bass sound was that he would play a bass, but then there would be loads of electric or just double basses bowing underneath it.
No, it wasn't bowed.
Oh.
It was double bass, but he would just play, minims or root notes.
Right.
just to sort of flesh it out.
And the story was like about 8 tracks of it or something.
No.
No? All right.
No.
There you go, bass players of the world.
This is the
They're
horse's
finally
mouth.
dispelled.
Yeah, no. The one thing I do remember a lot about is bass, really, partly because Sting's amazing bass player, and also he always used to play in the control room with me. Generally, on that first Ghost in the Machine album, he had one of those, which I don't really like, Steinberger basses. Steinberger, sorry. Very odd-looking carbon fiber thing, which didn't have very much bass on it. And I think it might have been my idea to overdub this double bass that he had, which was nicknamed, all their instruments were generally nicknamed something, and this double bass was called Brian, and it was an electric double bass that had a sort of metal pipe as the outside bit, if you see what I mean.
Oh yeah, yeah.
He also had a really nice old Fender jazz bass.
Okay, because he's got his Precision, his 1951 Precision, which he still uses a lot.
Yeah, that's the one that looks like a Telecaster.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, the original bass he had was a very old jazz bass.
Oh, okay.
But he seemed to like, I don't know, he liked the look of the Steinberger.
We all did. That's what I played. We all did. Yeah. I tell you what was great about the Steinberger, because it was a tiny little stick thing, and you carried it in like a little gun bag. And what was brilliant was that it never left your side. It went in the overhead locker on planes, and it was indestructible. You could put it between 2 chairs and jump up and down on it. I didn't, but...
If you've noticed, I've not spoken for a while. In fact, I think I nodded off at one point.
Poor old Gary.
I nodded off.
Say one last thing on the bass tech for any bass freaks who are listening.
I'm certainly not going to say no.
Well, everything used to go through a little Boss chorus pedal.
The Dimension D.
No.
Okay.
It was a Boss light blue chorus pedal.
CE2. The CE2.
And the knobs were set at 10 to 2. Also, he didn't have a bass amp. Never ever went through a bass amp. It was always just DI'd.
But I think, Gary, everything you ever did went through a Boss chorus as well, didn't it? So come on, you're in on this.
I can only apologise.
You're part of the problem, mate.
What they really want to know about is, was Stewart and Sting beating the shit out of each other?
Exactly.
Because I think that probably happened on the next album, didn't it?
It happened more on the second album. Yeah, I mean, they had physical confrontations. There was a famous physical confrontation at a gig in the south of France where Sting and Stewart got into a real rough and tumble, and Sting actually cracked one of Stewart's ribs and he couldn't play. And the great thing with the Police is their roadies could all substitute for their boss's instruments.
Oh, for the sound checks, they would have done that.
They were all understudies.
They were all understudies. And Stewart's roadie was a guy called Jeff, who was a fantastic drummer. And so he ended up playing the gig because it was like happened at sound check, this punch up. And so they couldn't not do the gig. So they got Jeff dressed up like Stewart and made sure the lighting guy didn't put any follow spots on him and did the whole gig and nobody noticed.
But when you did Synchronicity, was it tough for you in the studio with this sort of atmosphere?
To be honest, it's so weird because it really is one of my favourite records and a great record. I'm not blowing my own trumpet.
Well, Every Breath You Take. Geez.
And very successful. And it was...
It's a classic album, Hugh. You can blow away, mate.
Okay, well, thank you. But it was unbelievably painful to make at times. I mean, really, really. I remember ringing up my manager at one point and sort of almost crying down the phone saying, I can't take this anymore. Because every time I tried to sort of stop their Barneys, they would just turn around to me and say, fuck off, you don't know us at all, you know. I'd only worked with them for like probably 6 or 7 weeks on the first album. And then they'd gone off on tour and come back and we started the second album. And after 2 weeks in the studio in Montserrat, we literally didn't have anything to play at all. And there was a crisis meeting where Miles Copeland, the manager, was flown over. He hated Montserrat, but he just, he hated sort of any place that wasn't London or New York, basically. So he was never around. He flew over and we had a crisis meeting about whether we were going to carry on or split up the band there and then. And luckily, the decision was made to carry on. But I mean, it was really horrible to start with, and then we sort of got down to it. But I mean, even things like Every Breath You Take, if you listen to it, it's all made up of overdubs on drums. The bass drum is from the Oberheim DMX, I think it was called. You know, every time Stuart played, he wanted to play something to show off, because he's a fantastic drummer. You know, I mean, you know, the band is one of the best three-piece bands ever. Yeah. And he's a virtuoso, but he didn't like to sort of not be virtuoso. And as with everyone and every band, you've got to come to compromises sometimes. It was terribly difficult just to get him to sort of overdub, because that's what it was, the stuff that ended up on the song. And then we moved to Canada after a bit and did some overdubbing and mixed there. And Stuart and Sting didn't like to be in the same room together. So in the morning, Sting would go off skiing, because this studio is just by a ski resort. Stuart would come in the morning and want to sort of try overdubbing things, and then lunch would happen, and then Sting would come in and Stuart would go out skiing. And so one day Sting came in and he said, "What the fuck's that?" And we're listening to Every Breath You Take, and Stuart had put on what I call one of those sewing machine hi-hats. You know, so Sting, "What the fuck's that?" And I go, "Well, that's Stuart made me record."
Made me do it.
Bigger boys came.
He made me do it. And Sting said, "Well, I hate it. Get rid of it." And I said, "Well, don't you think we should sort of, you know, being the jolly sort of diplomat, don't you think we should talk about it with Stuart first?" "No, don't. I want you to wipe it now." And so I said, "Well, okay." And of course, we're on analog machines then. So when you wiped something, it literally disappeared forever. Whereas nowadays, you would just take the hi-hat off the playlist or whatever if you're doing Pro Tools. And so he literally came over and stood by the tape machine while he made me put that track into record and wipe it. So then the next day, Stuart comes in, "Where's my hi-hat gone?" So there would be a big Barney then. And I said, "Well, look, you know, I am sort of the producer and it is Sting's song. He wrote this song and I happen to agree with him that I don't think it needs that hi-hat." And so that was sort of made a tension between me and Stuart then as well. So, you know, it just went from difficulty to difficulty. And I just remember being so relieved when we all left.
So finally we're on to Trevor Horn, who's been on the show twice now, hasn't he? He was one of our early...
He was an early adopter, and we always said we were going to have to get him on, because what was fantastic was that, A, he's just such a great storyteller. You know, he's just a joy to be in the room with, isn't he? But what's amazing is that we didn't get any of the Trevor Horn stuff in that first one. All we got, but it was it's fantastic for anyone who doesn't, you know, who's interested in him, because he basically took us through that whole period of his life before he was Trevor Horn. I certainly learned an immense amount.
Yeah. You know, it's been a really good show, this, actually, because we've had three producers who really determined the sound of the 80s. Yeah, no doubt. Well, you know, Steve Lillywhite, Hugh, Padgham, and Trevor Horn, and Bob, obviously, before then, was, you know, determining quite a lot of the sound of rock in the 70s.
But I would make quite a bold statement here, I think, and I think it's very interesting that I think the 80s were far more producer led than subsequent decade. Like, I think when you think of the 90s, you think of artists much more than producers.
Oh.
Or is that a contentious...
No, you might be right.
Do I want to die on this hill, is the question.
Well, no, because you're right. Because if I immediately say who produced Oasis, what would you say?
I don't... Noel.
Well, you don't know, do you?
Yeah.
I can't remember either.
Stephen Street is kind of the most... Street. You know. But then again, Stephen Street is an 80s boy, really. You know, the Smiths, Stephen Duffy, all that, you know.
So you're right. Because what happened then in the 90s is there was, especially with Britpop, because we got to...
A Massive Attack, for instance. There's a definitive 90s act. Their Massive Attack is not anyone else.
Yeah, but because there was this really awful period that came in the early 90s when it was A&R man led.
Yes,
you know, and I'm
absolutely.
talking about boy bands, right? You know, and that kind of that kind of thing where, you know, they were very producer-led, you know, in the fact the artist invariably probably wouldn't even sing on their own records.
I'd say, you know.
Manager-led, yeah, exactly. But the indie sound, the kind of raw indie sound, in a way, in the 90s, was...
Steve Albini.
Well, in America, yeah. but it was in a way, it was a revolt against the poshness of the 80s.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So there was this idea of, you know, if we're going to get a producer, he really needs to be the guy who just sticks a microphone up in the room that we're playing in and tries to stop us from fighting.
Yeah, it's true. But then I guess this is also the rise of Rick Rubin, isn't it? Again, which is that strip of him reimagining sort of classic artists. There was a great article about this. Someone talking about the different ways of that people record. Just not in terms of making records, just straightforward recording. Like, for instance, if you listen to Tonight's the Night, the Neil Young live album, it sounds like you'd expect someone to sound standing on a hall in a theatre playing their songs. Whereas if you listen to Rick Rubin's Johnny Cash albums, you are literally sitting in his lap and he is singing in your ear.
Now we're in the age of producers being songwriters as well, because it's the producer is the guy who gets the beats up, who puts the chords down, and they can play those grooves to the artist who then comes up with a top line and some lyrics. So I think there's the producer stepping back from the publishing. That's gone. The producer now wants to be part of the songwriting.
But from where you're saying it, I think it's quite interesting. It's almost like there's a comparison here with directors. Like, I remember when Christopher Nolan was asked what it's like to direct a Batman film, where it's just a huge studio behemoth, you know, and you know, how much of a director are you? And he said, you're basically a traffic cop. And I think for a modern pop producer, that's probably quite a good analogy, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. You're talking about the sort of the you know, Mark Ronson or someone like that. You know, you're just organising the people coming in and out of the room.
You're facilitating all the stuff coming and going. Like you said, there's the beats guy, there's this guy, there's the bloke. You know, like Phil Manzanera was telling us about, the bloke whose job is to listen to albums from 1975 to 1979 and find samples. You know, that's. Yeah.
Well,
I've got this. It's from 1980. No good.
So let's play a clip of when we had Trevor Horn. This is one of our live shows, by the way. So there might be a little hubbub of happy audience in the background.
Yeah, which is
some
fabulous.
Of which
live at Cambridge Audio.
Yes, it might be you who's listening now. You were there. It's Trevor Horn.
Trevor, this all sort of begs the question about who do you prefer to produce, a band or a singer? It must. I mean, I don't want to preempt your answer.
No. Well, I mean, obviously it depends on the band. The problem I have found with bands is it's quite hard to work with people when you can play a lot better than them. Do you know what I mean? And this particularly applies when I've tried working with young bands. You know, I remember working with. I tried it a few years back. You know, a young bass player playing, and me and my engineer both around him, deadening the strings in between where he's playing, because he hasn't got any technique. He just plays and the whole bass rings, you know, that kind of stuff. Bands can be a pain, and obviously by the Murphy's Law, that the guy that gives you the most trouble is the least talented generally. Whereas, you know, when you're working with a singer, or just like a vocal group or something, you can hire all the musicians. And when you hire the musicians, everything's fabulous and the birds are singing and everything's nice.
Well, I know, because having worked with you quite a lot, and it's something I always like, and I never know what I'm going to be doing whenever I've come in to work with you. Sometimes it's playing bass. Sometimes it used to get me to play acoustic guitar quite a lot.
Yeah,
and you had this great maxim, which I think is probably, because you had this thing of like, basically get anyone, literally anyone, to play the acoustic guitar except the guitarist. Because, you know, I remember you once said, I'll have the guy delivering the pizza do the acoustic guitar before because the guitarist will go, well, I can give you this, or I can give you this, or I could do this, or how about if I do this? Whereas someone like me is just going to go C,
yeah,
G, which is what you want.
Yeah, most of the time, yeah. God, yeah.
Talking of single artists, I suppose Seal is just, your kind of relationship with Seal has been probably the longest out of everyone you've ever worked with, isn't it, Trevor?
Yeah, he's put up with me longer than anybody.
But do you think, is it something to do with, he's got the most credible voice, but sonically, his voice sits it. I've been in your studios when you've been working on some of those Seal songs and listen to it, and you can just feel how his voice places within this arrangement that you create around him so beautifully.
Yeah, he's got a lovely voice. He's one of those guys that whoever is singing such and such a song, he'll probably be able to sing it better. You know what I mean? He can sing anything. He does a great Sinatra. He's a great mimic. It's. I suppose he and I have the same sense of humour, like very sort of double entendre sense of humour. And sometimes if people are talking, they'll say something and I look at each other. Did they just really say, I can take it up the octave? Things like that, It's Seal's really funny. And back in, when I first started to work with him, I said to him, look, Seal, really, I don't mind how many girlfriends you have in the studio, but I don't want any male friends if you don't mind. He said, no mates, only birds. And he said, why? And I said, well, it's always male friends can really disrupt things. They say stuff like, do you think this is good? Or this sounds a bit lush or something like that, and ruin the whole session.
Yeah, or can I play my demo?
Yeah, something like that, yeah. They're always a bit jealous, whereas girlfriends are generally not jealous unless it's...
Well, it's an awful thing to admit, but it's in any studio situation. It's like you could almost just tell from the tape when a girl walks in the room.
Yeah.
Because everyone's showing off immediately, aren't they? It's why, it's why you became a musician, let's face it.
Seal used to have some amazing looking girls, like... He had one girlfriend out in LA who was about 6'3", and she was in a cop show, and she was gorgeous. And the night that he sang "Show Me" on the first album, she was sitting at his feet when he was singing it. And I was working with an American engineer called Steve McMillan, who was a very conservative guy. He was one of those sort of guys who always says stuff like, I do favor the LA 76 from 1973 because of the different tube that they use in here. He's one of those kind of guys. And this girl was there, and I said to him, gosh, she's a good-looking girl. And he says, it has always been a fantasy of mine to be gang raped by a group of female police officers. She could definitely be one of them.
When you're...
He's going to be happy with that going out on this, is he?
Yeah. When you're working...
Steve. You actually named him. There's been a lot of people you haven't named.
I don't think Steve will be bothered by that.
Trevor, when you're working with Seal, how quickly is it before you want the master vocal on there? Is it something that is going to tell you where everything else goes?
Well, with him, it's always persuading him to actually sing on the track, You get the track. Hey, see, we got the track.
He's nervous.
It's okay. Maybe tomorrow, And I used to stay in the same house as him, and I used to catch him in his suit going out for dinner. So just come on in and sing a couple of songs, I tried never to organise an actual session unless there was an emergency, But I'd just catch him on the fly. It was always better. And then he'd come back with a girl maybe at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he'd be in the mood. Hey, come on, sing these 2 songs again, And he'd sing them, and I'd always keep all of them and keep going through them.
You once described. I don't know if we can use. I don't want to upset anyone, but because it's one of the most brilliant descriptions I've ever heard, and which I've used often. You described him as having a whim of iron.
Whims of iron. I think we were all a lot younger then, and maybe a few of us had whims of iron. Maybe I was just as bad.
Your latest album, we should talk about your latest project, because it's we've jumped a few decades. Sorry, well we haven't really, but it's looking back as well, isn't it? And I've heard the few tracks that have been made available, and they sound absolutely amazing. How do you get about approaching a song that's already been established as a massive hit and everyone knows it inside out?
it's not easy, because as you work on the song, sometimes you find yourself thinking, God, I wish I could do it the way it is on the record, because that's obviously the way you do it. And you can't, because you're trying to bring something fresh to it. I mean, they're all songs. You know what songs are like. You know, you can do all kinds of things with them.
Dragged up the Joe Jackson song, because that's been a favourite of mine for years.
Yeah, it's a lovely song, that, yeah. But I was just looking for songs with good lyrics, you know, lyrics that I liked, that meant something, you know, that weren't just idiotic. And so all the songs are really chosen from that point of view. You know, a song's a song. You can do. Back in the day, you know, a song would become famous and everybody would cut. You know, Sinatra, Dean Martin, everyone would do their versions, and different arrangers would change the chords. It's the same kind of thing, isn't it, really? I mean, if anything, Nelson Riddle was always there was always lots going on in his records, you know what I mean? In between each of the lines, something happened, you know?
Yeah.
And you're still working with Anne Dudley on it?
No, I haven't worked with Anne for a long time.
That was an amazing relationship, though.
No, we had I did a lot. Funny enough, in the end, I did some big shows with Anne. You know, where we'd play on. You know, we did a big thing with Robbie at the. You know, when he had his anniversary, we played a 13-minute medley in Earl's Court. Oh. Anne's funny, because I mean, I remember we were all at the bar at the end of that show. And people were talking about, who have you got in your in-ears? And Anne said, I've always got the drums, and I've got you. You're generally in the right place. I was like, Anne, you paid me a compliment. I can't believe it.
Oh, it's one of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that you've been asked this a million times, but I want to ask if my own self-interest in that, who do you regret not producing? Who would you have loved to have done?
I mean, you know, I know it sounds absurd, but I wouldn't have mind having a go at Bob Dylan at one point.
Yeah,
that would have been interesting.
Wow.
Yeah, just because it's so different from what you know. And a friend of mine who's a property developer wrote a song based on, you know, Desolation Row, called Desolation U Row. And as a favour for him, I did a recording of it. I had a band for another session, and at the end of it, I said to them, "We're going to do a version of Desolation Row. You guys know it, right?" And we did it in one take, with me singing a guide vocal, because I know it so well. I used to be a Bob Dylan.
You do a great Bob Dylan. You do a great Brian Ferry, in fact, don't you? From when you did your Top of the Pops albums.
I used to sing him on the top. And we had such fun, because it was verse after verse after verse.
And you knew all the lyrics?
I knew all the lyrics, yeah. And you know what it's like when you've got something like that. You have to find something different in each verse. I thought, God, I would have liked to have done this.
So that was good. I enjoyed this episode.
Yeah. Sorry, I thought you were actually talking to me, Gary. And of course you weren't. You were actually. I thought you actually
I'm talking
just saying that.
I'm talking to you in real life and in podcast life as well. We are one and the same.
We are. No fourth wall.
So we're just getting this straight in our head. This is going out Sunday. In 2 days' time, we are flying into Europe for 4 to 5 weeks with Nick Mason in Europe. I think we start in Holland.
We start in Holland, in Utrecht, and we might be delaying our start time, mightn't we, because of the Holland game.
That's true.
But and we will be doing everything we can to try and squeeze in more interviews, like we did last time. We've done it before.
Do you know what? Just putting feelers out there, because if we can't find someone to interview, as we haven't today, and sometimes we can't even do the edit thing of greatest hits, we might just have a chat while we're on the road and put that up as our pod. I think that should be okay. People
would you like that? Let us know.
Yeah, let us know, please.
Do we want to know that?
The answer's on a postcard.
They're going to be beastly.
Yeah, they only want me, they said.
Yes, I know. And as we go back on, and by the way, there was it's now however many days later, but we're quite a lovely landmark last night. We played Brighton, which is always quite special, playing the Brighton Dome, which of course, because it's the hallowed stage where Pink Floyd first performed what was then called Eclipse, a Piece for Assorted Lunatics, but we know as Dark Side of the Moon, back in November 72. And Nick got up and pointed out that it was actually him and my 500th gig playing together.
No, that was, well, of course, it was our wonderful guitarist, Professor Lee Harris, who came up with that number. He worked it out, calculated it.
Yeah. Or just made it up, frankly, because none of us are going to.
But how amazing. 500 shows with Nick Mason. I think that's got to be more shows than Roger played with Nick Mason.
It's got to be, yeah.
Anyway, on that note, thank you very much for listening. Thank you to Ben Jones for putting this show together for us for Gimme Sugar. And we are the Rockonteurs, and we will continue doing it throughout this tour.
And it's good night from me.
And it's good night from them.
Rockonteurs is produced by Gimme Sugar Productions for Warner Music Group UK.